All right, I'm here in the Mark Haney studio
Yes.
holding.
The Marquee Media Studio inside Mark Tank.
Yes, feels a little bit awkward holding the mic with the great Mark Haney, but I am excited to be here to help tell the story of Mark Haney and to help all the listeners and all the followers really understand what drives you and what drives the HaneyBiz community. So thanks for setting this up, Mark.
You bet. I think this is going to be a fun day, and I actually look forward to kind of sharing where we came from because we've come a long way, baby.
Great. So let's begin at the beginning, as they say. And, I think it's interesting based on so much you talk about being a hometown entrepreneur and, having your grandson play Little League on the same field that you played Little League and so much you invest in your hometown. But one of the most interesting things I learned about you was you were born in Japan.
I was. My dad was an electronics technician in the Air Force and stationed in Fukuoka, Japan, and so that's where my older sister and I were born.
Yeah. Does that have any significance to you? I mean, when you think about being born in other countries, is it just a bullet point on the resume, or
It's probably just something that is. I haven't put it on the resume. I don't know if I've ever actually typed up a resume. Now that you mention it, but I'd say it's just an interesting antidote in my life, and so I've gone back to Japan a number of times for business, and I've never gone back to the hometown where I was actually born, but been to some of the main cities. Never went back to the hometown. I've always thought about that, though.
maybe a pilgrimage in your future?
I may have to.
Great. So then the real beginning is in Roseville, California, right?
I would say so. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's. We moved here when I was a baby.
Okay. And so growing up with a family, mother, dad, and multiple siblings. So tell us about that.
Yes. 3 boys and a girl, all 1 year apart. So we all went to high school at exactly, at the same moment at Oakmont High School. But in terms of the growing up, the Haney family, it was good. My dad was strict in his own way, kind of a guy that worked a lot and came home and put down the hammer a little bit here and there, but really left it to my mom to run the household, right? So she was the day-to-day manager of our household. But it was a good family. We were very close. I think if there's one thing that I can think of off the top of my head that I took away was the importance of family. We had a very, very close family, and there was this commitment to loyalty among family members.
Great. I want to talk a little bit about your, the starting in business with your family, but I know how important teamwork and being competitive is to you. So tell us a little bit about growing up in Roseville with that family and sports and, competing with your brothers and some of those stories.
My brothers and sisters are far more competitive than I am,
I don't
which
believe
is kind of it's kind of interesting that they are. So we're all 1 year apart. They are basically straight A students, and then I come along and maybe, especially in high school, was a little more carefree, more of I call myself the C student, but I had my ups and downs because I was focused on football and baseball and a social life, throwing parties, things like that. So that's what high school was like. But I think when we go back to the early beginnings of being on a team, I think I learned a lot of that on the baseball field and on the football field as a youngster.
Yeah. And I know you were very passionate about baseball, right?
I was, yeah. I guess that's the first sport. Back when I was a kid, it was like the first sport you end up playing. And so we got signed up for baseball, and it was competitive. And everybody at that point in Roseville, there was one Little League, and everybody from all over town came to play at Roseville High School at the Little League Diamond, which is where my grandson plays today. And there was a lot of kids playing baseball, and so one of the big goals when I was 12 was that you wanted to make all-stars, and I was a pretty good player. And I remember one time, and this was one of the lessons that I learned about getting, overconfident. I was expecting to make the all-star team, and as they called out the names to go out there for the all-star team, the whole town is rallied around this closing ceremony, and they're saying from the A's, Robbie Bosco, and from the Dodgers, Hank DeMello. And as they marched through and they announced the names, I kept kind of playing with my buddies, like pretending like I was going to run out on the field because I kept expecting my name to get called. And when they announced the last one, they got to number 14, I didn't get my name called. And I had been overconfident, I suppose, and it hit me. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I left the field, started running around the track at Roseville High School, ran home, jogged home that night, and what I would say is I've been running ever since, right? I think that it was probably that day, if there was ever a time when I got the wake-up call that don't be overconfident. You're going to have to outwork people, and I think that's when I decided it wasn't going to come to me naturally. I better work for everything.
Yeah, so it was a wake-up call, something that motivates you today, right? It reminds me of, the Michael Jordan story, right? I mean, greatest basketball player probably ever, doesn't make his JV team.
It doesn't remind me of the Michael Jordan story. This was, one of the small guys on the team that was kind of a hard trier, not really the natural athlete. Probably thought I was a little bit better at that stage than what I was, and then I ended up working really hard. We made I made the 15-year-old all-star team as I got a little bit older, mostly because of practice. And that 15-year-old all-star team, we lost to Hawaii, one game away from the Little League World Series. So we actually had Roseville had a very competitive, in my age group, we had a very competitive set of athletes. And I was fortunate enough to make the team when I was 15, and we went pretty far.
Nice. Air Haney, you don't want to do that? Air Haney?
Air Haney, no.
All right. So that's great. I mean, that's really informative to kind of the things and the lessons that motivate you and inspire you. So,
well, and I think that the other thing that goes along with that I'll add to that is the coaches that I had. So my dad didn't coach me. My dad was working. In fact, I probably played catch with my dad twice in my life. My dad was he loved football. But he wasn't the type of guy to come out and play catch with us and so on. So I learned a lot from my coaches, right? So one in particular, John Walls, he was the coach of that 15-year-old all-star team. And I feel like I learned a lot from those setbacks on the ball field, whether it be football or baseball. And so I think setbacks in general have sort of shaped who I've become.
Yeah. I know also there's a particular football story. I think you were in high school, and it was a practice, and there was this moment where you had to become a leader. So tell me a little bit about that story and how you learned leadership through sports.
Well, I think that's when I woke up to the idea of being a leader at some level. So I was up on the JV football team as a freshman. I was a decent little football player, and they didn't have a quarterback down on the freshman team, and so they moved me down to play freshman. I was a freshman, so I moved down to play freshman football, and really hadn't played a lot of quarterback, but I could throw a football, and we had a running offense, and I could run a little bit. So they moved me down to play quarterback, and we lost the first 3 games. It was brutal, and we had just got blown out by Placer, like 47-0. And just got killed. And so we were coming out for Friday practice. You play on a Thursday night if you're a freshman. And so we were getting ready for practice on Friday after school. And the coach was Coach Glenn Poole, and he was one of these legendary football coaches from the area who was on the tail end of his career. So he's kind of like helping out with the freshman team, right? He's now the freshman football coach after he's been varsity for several years. So as the varsity old school football coach, he decides he's going to give us a little talking to before practice. And so gathered us all around before practice. And he said, "You guys don't act like you want to play football," and kind of read us the act. And he said, "So here's what we're going to do. I want you guys to take the weekend and think about whether you even want to play football or not." And we all kind of looked at each other. So, and if you don't want to play football, then this weekend you just come in Monday and you turn in your gear. And so he's like, now get out of here. And I said, Coach, can I ask a question? And he's like, yeah, what is it, Haney? And he says, and I said, well, Coach, where I come from, if we want to get better in football, we practice. And he just looked at me, and he gave me this dirty look, and he said, okay, Haney, you guys, we're going to play, we're going to practice today, so why don't you go out there and line up on the 40-yard line. So we all lined up on the 40-yard line of the practice field, and he began to have us run wind sprints. It was down, said hike, yeah, and then we'd run. We had to take off 40 yards. The first one's not too bad, and then you run 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. And after a while, you start getting pretty tired. We weren't getting any rest in between the wind sprints, and people began to get pretty darn fatigued, including myself. We all were. And we had been doing it probably about 10 minutes straight, wind sprints, and people began to drop off, right? Some of the heavier linemen were, not being able to run the full sprint and starting to walk and having to, bend over. And it was probably about 20 minutes in, maybe 30 minutes in, and I looked around because the team was collapsing, right? And because he was saying is, this one's on Haney, and it was down, said hike, and we would run. So he was sort of telling the team that the reason we were running sprints was my fault. And before every sprint, he would sort of think about Haney when you're running this sprint. And so they were all, I think in some way, angry with me. But more than that, we were exhausted. And so I decided to take it upon myself, and I said, hang on a second, right? And I went up and I stood out where the coaches were standing, and I faced my teams, and I said, stand up, get up, Castro, get up, Clancy, stand up. I got something to tell you guys. And so I began to give them rest, right? As I began to talk to them about the upcoming game that we had against Marysville. And it's like, hey, this week, you guys, we have Marysville, right? And if we want to be at our best against Marysville, we need to be in tip-top physical condition, right? So we're going to need to run these sprints hard. And basically, I was stalling, right? I stalled out these sprints, and so I said, get back on the line, and here we go. After I gave him about 45-second rest, and I called the cadence as the quarterback. What a concept! And I'm like, okay, you guys, let's do this one. Down, said hike, and we ran the sprint. And I continued to do that same thing. After every sprint, instead of letting the coaches call the cadence, I would take it upon myself to give the team a little bit of a pep talk before we ran the sprint, and pretty soon, I think the coaches got tired of that. I don't think they knew how to react to this. And so we ran sprints for another, I'd say 10 or 15 minutes, but we took good long breaks while I gave the team a pep talk and gave them their adequate rest. Pretty soon, the coaches walked to the locker room. And as the coaches were walking to the locker room, I called the team in, and we won 3 of the next 4 games. And I think at that point, I sort of realized, I guess maybe the coaches were trying to say, hey, somebody on this team needs to step up and lead. And it's those times when you sort of, you look around to the person to the left of you and the right of you, and you're like, well, somebody here's got to lead. And if it's not them, guess what? It's you. And that was one of those days. And it's a lesson that has come back to me in running businesses as well, because I feel like at some point, at some level, I'm kind of just this team guy. But if you're the CEO of a company, you have to be able to lead.
Great. Yeah, that's really inspiring. Let's talk a little bit about the family business. And before we jump into Placer Video, which I know you'll think is the family business, I want to talk about the paper route and some of the things you learned there, and working with your brother in an early age, Paul, and I think it's a great story. So tell us about that.
Yeah, it's easy to look back and pull the lessons away from something that it wasn't really that easy, right? You go through things that aren't that easy. So I was helping my this older kid. I was in the 3rd grade, if you can believe that. I was like late in the 3rd grade. I'm helping deliver the Sacramento Union. Andy Boss has the Sacramento Union, and I'm helping him after school with I'd get up in the morning and help him with his paper route. And one day he's like, hey, Mark, I'm going to get a better job. Right? He was in high school. I think he was going to get a job with a pizza parlor or something. And he's like, hey, you want my route? And I'm like, sure, let me go home and ask my mom. So went home, asked my mom, and she said no. But guess what? The next morning, the newspaper showed up at our house. So it was like, Mom, I think I got a paper route. And so my mom said, okay, I guess you can have it. So she sort of helped put me in business by allowing me to do that. But I had my brother help me. And so we would, work on delivering the paper and making some good money. And, I learned different lessons in having a paper route. But some of the biggest lessons were around how to treat customers and how to over deliver and some things like that.
Yeah, I think there's a particular story about a customer that really taught you a lesson about customer service.
It's one of my favorite stories about Mr. Schmidt. So this is what I call we lived in the pickup truck neighborhood where it was kind of a working class, kind of a tract home type development. A lot of pickup trucks on the street, but this one pickup truck was a little nicer than everybody else. Mr. Schmidt, he owned the A&W. He had the manicured lawn. His wife had a Lincoln Continental. They had a backyard swimming pool. Everybody respected Mr. Schmidt. And so as we were making the deliveries, my brother and I would practice our throwing skills, and we'd typically get it on the porch of our customers. But occasionally it ended up on the sidewalk or missed the porch at some level. Well, the Schmidts had automatic sprinklers. And so back in those days, when you at the end of each month, you'd go and collect. Instead of them sending you the check, you would walk around and collect door to door. So I was going around door to door at the end of one of the months, and Mr. Schmidt answers the door. I'm collecting for the union. He's like, "Oh yeah, Mark, here you go. Hey, by the way, can I ask you a question?" And I'm like, "Sure." He's like, "Hey, sometimes you get the newspaper on the porch, and other times, it's on the." It's on the sidewalk, and I'm kind of just wondering what would it take to get you to put it on the porch all the time. And I was humiliated. I was embarrassed because apparently when his sprinklers went on, it got the newspaper wet, and and he's got the soggy paper, and I'm like, he said, if you do it consistently, there might be something for you extra at the end of the month. And so that night I got home, and Paul and I were laying in bed, my little brother Paul, talking about Mr. Schmidt and his complaint. And, we started saying, what would it do? What would it take to get it on the porch, all the time? And Paul and I would kind of go back and forth, and we were competitive in nature. And I'm saying, well, what if we got it on the porch all the time? And he's like, yeah, that's a good idea. And I'm like, wait, how about this? Here's one better. What if we got it on that little ledge that you put that little ledge in front of the doorway, the threshold? It's like, what if we put it on that ledge every time? And he's like, yeah, that's a great idea, but I got one better. What if we put it on the ledge, but we tip it up against the door so that when you open the door, boom, the newspaper falls in the house? And I'm like, yeah, in-home delivery, baby. Yeah. So we started doing the in-home delivery the next day, and wouldn't you know it, all our customers were happy, including Mr. Schmidt. We became the talk of the neighborhood as we grew our newspaper route from like 40 to 80 in the course of a year and a half, and became the fastest growing Sacramento Union paper route in the entire Sacramento region. Made a lot of extra money in tips, got a lot of prize money. And really, I think the lesson is, I guess, listen to your customer, do something so outlandish that people are talking about you. We call it shocking them, right? So, and good things happen. And so it's been a lesson that I've taken forward in life. Is instead of just doing a good job, how do you do a job so well that the entire neighborhood is talking about you? That's what we did as little kids with the Sacramento Union.
And it was your first exit too, right?
Yeah, it was so, we had built a cool paper route and kind of the talk of the neighborhood. Well, my dad had owned his own TV shop, and he was having a little bit of success with his TV business, and so we moved to a little bit nicer house, and so we had to leave. We were moving across town, so I couldn't take my paper route with me, but everybody wanted my paper route, right? So I ended up creating an auction. I had some kids that were older than me. They were in 7th or 8th grade, and they all wanted my paper route. So I created an auction, ended up auctioning off my paper route to a 7th grader, Guy Moody, and he threw in some cash, some recurring revenue for future earnings, and I sold my paper route. Incredible story.
Yeah.
I was going to sell it to a guy that had a mini bike because he was going to throw in this mini bike. My mom wouldn't let me have a mini bike, so I couldn't do it. So I ended up having to take the cash with the earnout.
Mom, the true CEO.
Yes.
So some, entrepreneur at the age of what?
Well, I mean, I sold that thing the summer going into 6th grade, so that's when we moved across town.
Right. So let's talk about the other family business, Placer Video.
Yes.
So how did you get involved? What was your first day?
So first day was, basically as a summer going into the 6th grade, you're not capable of doing a whole heck of a lot, but you can do manual labor. So pulling weeds that were built in, you spend all day pulling weeds and you make about 10 feet of progress because the weeds are so thick. And you're out there with the shovel and you basically are digging into dirt around the outside of the building, pulling thick weeds, and you make about 10 feet of progress per day. And you look around the building and you're like, this is going to take me all summer to do a good job on pulling the weeds. And so that first summer, basically, the only break I got was to go inside to let the sweat dry, and I got to polish the TVs and wipe down the refrigerators and the washers and dryers. That was like the good part of the job. I cleaned the bathrooms. At least it was not so hot outside. So that was year one. As I got older, we learned how to do things around the business. I learned how to deliver TVs and appliances and hook up washers and dryers and dishwashers and ice makers and all these kind of things, and got really good with a hand truck. So I became kind of an appliance and TV handyman, if you will. All of us brothers did.
Now, before you start saying your next word, the hand truck, there's one particular story that I recall of a very expensive refrigerator and your
Yes.
dad observing some not so handy work. So tell us about that.
Well, my name as I got older, my nickname around the office, if you will, was El Slicko. And it was because I was sort of accident prone. I had been in a number of car accidents. I was a pretty hard trier, but maybe a little bit careless with things. So as you might imagine, somebody who delivers washers and dryers and televisions to customers around the Sacramento area, you get pretty good with the hand truck. You get pretty good at, kind of getting efficient. So, but one of the other skills I had was I was good at throwing parties outside. So I was sort of that student that played a lot of sports, but threw some pretty good parties as well. My parties were off the charts. It's actually has served me well as an entrepreneur. But that day, I was in a hurry to get back to a party. It was a Friday, and I was hustling back home with a refrigerator, and I needed to bring back the refrigerator into the warehouse. And it was a brand new TFF 24R GE side-by-side, ice and water in the door, right? These things were like $1,000 refrigerators. Bringing it back in, and I think it had something, something minor with it, and I had to bring it back in so that we could take a look at it. So I'm sliding it back to the end. I'm backed into the warehouse, getting ready to unload the refrigerator, and so I slide it to the end of the tailgate, and it's on one of these hydraulic lift gates, right? So you lift up the handle, and that lowers the tailgate simultaneously. So I pushed it all the way back, and I began to lift up on the handle for the lift gate, and it began to lower the refrigerator, but the refrigerator hadn't been pushed back all the way completely onto the lift gate. So as I lifted up, the refrigerator began to tip, and I can remember this like almost like slow motion, right? It happened fast, but you're lifting up, and then all of a sudden, if you can imagine this big, heavy refrigerator beginning to fall, and then it's like, there it goes. There's no stopping it. And all of a sudden, bam, the refrigerator crashes onto the warehouse floor and made a ton of noise. And my mother runs around the corner. Mark, are you okay? Are you okay? And, and I'm like, yeah, I'm okay. And then there's my dad, right? He comes around the corner, not quite so concerned. He's got this slow walk, and I'm sitting there with the lift gate in my hand, still just humiliated. My dad walks around the corner, and he gives me the best advice I think that I've ever gotten in business. He looks at me and he says, "You know what else, Slicko?" And he takes this big hit off his Camel cigarette. "You know what else, Slicko? You better surround yourself with good people, 'cause you ain't worth a spit." And he threw down his Camel cigarette and he crushed it into the floor of the warehouse, and he just shook his head and he walked back away. And it was the most embarrassing moment, if you can imagine. GE side-by-side broken into thousands of pieces. There goes $1,000. And I'm just sitting there going, embarrassed, right? But I did learn the lesson. Because if you're not, first of all, be more careful with other people's things, but also, maybe I should take my dad's advice and put people in my life that were good or better at the things that I wasn't as good at. So I was good at throwing a party, so I began to focus more just as hard on my party throwing skills. And I think that's what I've done as I've built the different companies and attempted to, be a business person this last several years.
So a valuable lesson from Dad and learning on the job, if you will. Talk to us about when you started getting some management responsibility and how that felt and what you learned.
What happened was we sold VCRs, and so as the VCR was developed, there was the idea of renting movies, right? So we all remember video stores like Blockbuster and Hollywood and so on. So before that, there was just the mom and pop. The first inventors, I guess, of the video store were these mom and pops. Well, we were in perfect position because we sold TVs, which meant we sold VCRs, and so we began buying videotapes. So we were the first video store in the Sacramento region, and we had because we had the ability to sell these VCRs. So we would sell a VCR, and then we would buy a few tapes, and ultimately created the rental thing. And I think it was at that point when my mom and dad sort of saw that the leadership potential in me, because we began to the video stores began to blossom, if you will, the first video store. And so we would sell a lot of VCRs, which created a customer base for the video rental. And the employee base was my friends from high school, right? So I was able to recruit the young people from around the region to come in and be a part of this new party called the video store. And we built our VCR sales team with that best friend that bought the first house and our other buddies from high school. And we created a sales machine for VCRs and a rental operation for videotape rentals. And I think that's when I think my parents started saying, "Wow, Mark's ability to throw a party is starting to help out." So it really was a learning experience, and I think that's where I got my first taste of really, I guess, management and leadership outside the athletics. And I think one of the things that I learned, right, because you look back and you're like, what did we learn? Because my dad was a pretty shrewd business person, a little bit, a great sales guy that could also fix televisions, right? So an interesting combo, very technical, but a good salesperson. My mom did the books. And so as my dad sort of looked at this opportunity, he said, "Mark, what do you think about us sort of focusing on the beta side of things versus the VHS?" And I'm like, "Okay, great." He's like, because these beta machines are really, really cheap, right? The beta was kind of the ones that there was two formats, beta and VHS. VHS was more popular, but beta had the less expensive VCR. It was cheaper. And so my dad, Sony was beta, and it was a little bit higher quality, and you can get a movie either way. And so what we decided was, let's sell as many VCRs as we can, almost give away the VCR, if you will. So we sold the VCRs at cost, dollar over cost, lived off of a rebate, and we sold thousands of VCRs per month, right? We basically flooded the Sacramento area with beta VCRs, right? So where the rest of the country was VHS, Sacramento had a extremely high percentage of beta VCRs because this little family business in Roseville flooded the South Placer region and much of the Sacramento region with beta VCRs because they were so cheap. And every time we sold a beta VCR, would create a beta rental customer. And, it was interesting because nobody else really stocked beta tapes. As the other video stores began to open up, Blockbuster, Hollywood, and so on, they didn't have beta. They just had VHS. So every time we sold a VCR, we created a built-in customer. They couldn't go anywhere else to rent a movie, kind of like the Gillette razor story. So that was an interesting thing that my dad developed, but I learned something from that. Ultimately, we recruited my younger brother and my older brother back into the business. The three brothers bought out my parents' video stores. We closed down the TV shops and the VCR sales. And we ended up with 12 video stores in the Sacramento region, really kind of a local regional powerhouse for video stores. A lot of lessons through that experience.
Yeah, and I know there's a particular lesson. You like the sports analogies and the Wayne Gretzky quote about skating to where the puck's going. And the first time that I know, at least, that you had to do that was you started to see other video stores, chains, and franchises opening up. So tell us about, how you observed that in the market and how you use these leadership skills to respond.
Well, interesting. So we had pricing. During that time, we created a pricing scheme. It was $199 all the time, and got that out there. But I think the real so one of the lessons was three brothers getting to figuring out how to run a video stores together, right? And because we had bought them from my parents, and we were in tons of debt. So you're in an industry that is becoming saturated in many ways by the Blockbusters and the Hollywoods and the national chains. And so the mom and pops were getting squeezed a little bit. Simultaneously, the other thing that was happening to the video store industry at that stage was the advent of cable TV, right? And so we all knew that, cable was becoming a lot more popular, which was competition. And there was this thought that streaming would be coming at some point, right? As soon as the internet came out, there would ultimately be streaming like we know today. And so we knew that was off in the distance, but we knew it was coming at some point. So what do you do? I think my older brother had lost some confidence in the business. Because we were basically seeing our revenues decline with all the competition, still managing to be profitable, but still heavily in debt as young people. And I think at that point, we realized, something's got to give. And as my brother began to show less desire, my older brother, he was the finance guy. As he began to show less desire for the business, the younger brother and I, Paul, we decided to buy him out and got ourselves into more debt. And so, I looking back at that, it's not like here we are in the middle of the COVID crisis where people who are overly indebted might be worried. We were a little bit worried, but we were still planning on opening up, getting to our 100 video stores. But thinking, hey, maybe we'd take a get-rich-quick scheme on the way. So we had, and this is probably the biggest lesson that turned out to be sort of a blessing in disguise. We made the decision to loan some money to one of our former suppliers. He was what I would call the richest guy we knew, right? Maybe one of the most successful people in Sacramento. He had sold his supply, his videotape supply company, and was doing other things, owned a number of companies. But he was going through a lawsuit with Panasonic, and he needed to borrow some money in order to get through the lawsuit. So he asked us to borrow $100,000. All right, so but he was going to make it worth our while. And so my brother and I decided, we went out and drew down on our line of credit, loaned this guy some money, and he came back to us a few weeks later and he needed some more money. So, we loaned him some more money, and because he was still continuing this lawsuit, and he's like, "Don't worry," and he kept saying that along the way that the payback would be that much greater, right? And so one of the things that happened was it had got up to, I think it was like $567,000. And at this time, I'm like 27, 28 years old. Paul's a year younger than me. We are already heavily in debt from the purchase of these video stores and all the other things that we were doing in terms of opening up stores. And now we had loaned somebody, the last of what was there on our credit line, all for this get rich quick scheme. Because once he had won the lawsuit, he was gonna pay us back in these extremely handsome returns. He filed bankruptcy, and we lost that money. And so in the bankruptcy was this little company called Northern Video. And so Paul and I kind of looked at each other. None of the other creditors wanted his little company. And this company sold VCR, like industrial VCRs and so on. And Paul and I were like, okay, do you want to take a shot at taking this little industrial VCR company out of bankruptcy in exchange for our debt? And so we did, and that led to a whole series of challenges. But ultimately, it meant that we found a way to pivot from the video store industry, because the video store industry, as we know, ended up dying. So we, by accident, ended up pivoting to video hardware sales. And there are so many lessons. Once the Northern Video story begins, there is lesson after lesson after lesson. But in that particular situation, the big lesson that I get is, again, fall back to the surround yourself with good people. What we decided to do, instead of panicking, we took over that business, and we got put on credit hold with all the manufacturers, Sony and Panasonic and so on. Everybody put us on credit hold. But we decided to do one thing, to bring in our friends. We recruited our video store, the most sales-oriented video store workers, the friends that I had from high school that had become salespeople, and we figured out a way to sell our way out of it. So I think if there's a lesson in there is, like, no matter how bad it gets, no matter how indebted you are, if you don't quit and you put the right people in your life that can sell stuff, right, there is a way to sell your way out of it. And that's ultimately what we did. We sold our way out of that crisis that was basically we were on the verge of bankruptcy.
Yeah, great lessons. I want to, wrap this chapter, and, I've heard you kind of think about, this chapter in your life as becoming a man. So as you think about, obviously we talked about you being a boy and your first entrepreneurial escapades and, learning the family business and taking over for the family. But, if you were to think about this chapter and how it brought you from, boyhood to manhood, how does it feel? What do you think about?
Well, I'd say if there was a turning point, it would be the day my mom got sick. So, I don't spend a lot of time talking about her, because she got sick when I was I was probably about 26 or 27. We had the three brothers had just it was interesting. The day we finalized the purchase of the business from my parents, we had been acquiring parts of the business for a few years, and the day that we acquired the rest, my mom was unable to sort of celebrate with us that was happening, because my mom had a headache, and my mom was my best friend, right? So a lot of people think of me and my brother as best friends, which we were close since paper routes and then building businesses together. But really, my mom was kind of my best friend. She was the cool mom. She was the one that let me have the parties, right? So I had that mom. So the day she started getting headaches, it ended up being a brain aneurysm, brain surgery, and coma. They pronounced her, they gave her last rites, probably a couple months into the hospital stay. And it was really saying goodbye to my mom. Miraculously, she woke up, but when she woke up, she couldn't talk and really never quite came back. It's one of those stories where she didn't come back as the way my mom was as that best friend. And so I think you talk about becoming a man, Rick. I think when you are forced to grow up, I could even whether it was a challenge with one of my family members, whether with my wife, with having kids, I could always run to my mom. Mom, give me some advice. What do you think? And she would hug me and tell me, everything was going to be okay, and give me the back rub and send me back out there. And kind of, I think when I lost that person on that day at that time, and she came back different. I was forced to really do some soul searching, and who was I going to be without that person? And it turned out to be I found other people to fill those gaps. My brother Paul, when it comes to business, really filled that gap. He and I, as I mentioned, bought out my older brother, and it was he and I that pivoted and found a way to dig our way out of all that debt. So Paul ended up stepping in to that role, if you will. And I would say more as of late, this last several chapters of my life, my wife and my children have really filled in that void as well. So people do fill in those voids. As sad as that was, I guess we all need to grow up at some point. And I think it was at that point when I realized I needed to rely on myself. It's still difficult every day.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that story. It's it's touching, and I think there's a lot of lessons we can get from this. Life lessons, business lessons, family lessons. How to compete, how to be a leader. There's so much in just this first chapter that you've captured, and so thank you for opening up and being personal and inspiring and sharing with all of us. We'll move on, to the next chapter, which you gave a little preview of in the next episode. We'll be talking about scaling that entrepreneurial mountain with Northern Video. So looking forward to that.
Thank you, Rick. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching today's show. My goal for every episode is that you find a takeaway, something tangible you can use in your business today. And if you have a comment about a favorite takeaway, feel free to put it in the box below. And if you have a topic that you'd like me to bring up on the show, don't forget to let me know. And also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want to learn more about entrepreneurship. Because at HaneyBiz, we are always by your side.